Okay, well, hello. My name is Andrés Duany. I believe that thanks to Andrew, I've spoken to some of you before. You may not recognize me. I'm one more of these guys with a beard. You know, somehow it happens one morning. You just let it go. And of course, this will signify that this is a post-COVID time in our history. And I have had my partners in the architectural firm DPZ have had the good sense to say we had better think about the 21st century. And they've delegated me actually for a couple of years to think about things. And several things have come up. One of them is the crisis of affordable housing. What I spoke about last time that I was with you guys and girls was the prospect of climate change and climate change adaptation, and I had quite a long time to talk about that. Well, something happened in between on the way there, which is the pandemic. And so I've had to switch, or rather overlay, the pandemic to what was going to happen anyway with climate change. And the other thing which I will not speak about today is something which we'll overlay again, which is that this is all very costly. The pandemic has had devastating economic effects, and that too will have an effect. But I'm just going to be right there in the middle, because it's a very short presentation, and speak about the pandemic and what that implies. Okay? Now, I'm speaking as an architect and an urbanist, somebody who designs cities and alters cities to fit society. So it's limited. You know, nothing that I'm going to say is medical. That's another, or political. It's the physical design of community. So what has the pandemic brought? And I suppose that the first thing to think about is not so much how long this will last, which could be this might last, it's already for sure going to last a year. Some people are speaking about lasting 2 years, and might be even longer. The important thing is what effect will it have? You know, how long will we remember it? How long will it affect our lives? And for that, we don't know, but we have a very useful surrogate, which is 100 years ago, there was the pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu. Now, that one is said to have actually killed, I don't know, between 20 and 50 million people. It seems worse than this one. And yet it was over in 3 years. And then people say, well, if you look at that pandemic of 1918, we were having the roaring 20s right after. I mean, we just forgot about it, and we partied, and I think you've all seen the roaring 20s, you know, the dancing and the short skirts and the jazz and all that great stuff. Well, it turns out that that did indeed happen, the roaring 20s, but it was a very small segment of the population. If you look at any aspect of, you know, and you can see it in many movies, they were young people in their 20s, they were urban, and they sure looked like they were rich. You know, champagne and really beautiful dresses and shoes, etc., and beautiful, beautiful halls. So yes, there was a segment of the population that partied on, you know, that recovered from the terrible crisis. Now, what happened to the rest? What else happened? Well, there was the Nazis, the Depression, the Spanish Civil War, the Second World War, communism in many places in Europe, a lot of disruption. So there's the other side. You know, there was a huge effect, and how permanent was it? Well, and how bad was it? Like the change, was the change bad or good? Now, the bad news is that the change lasted a long time. You know, there was a cultural memory. The good news is that most of the changes were for the good. And I'd like to explain what happened. In those days, there was no vaccines. They had no even hope of a vaccine. And what they discovered is that with all this kind of disease, sunlight and breeze and air, fresh air and sunlight was curative. And I think we have pretty much arrived at the same conclusion. We can be outdoors, and it's okay to meet with people. We need a lot of vitamin D, which the sun gives us, And it's very important to do whatever we do outdoors. It's better outdoors. Being indoors is toxic. I think we know that already. That was exactly the same that happened in those days. And that changed architecture and changed urbanism. And I'd like to point out how, first of all, how it changed urbanism. I don't think we realize the extent to which Florida and Los Angeles, Southern California, and let's say Spain in Europe, the Balearic Islands and so forth, the Costa del Sol, how unoccupied they were. Florida did not begin developing till the 20s. Everybody in California was up where the money was, which was up in San Francisco, Seattle, Portland. That's where the money was. LA, that's where the Hispanics were. It was not the cool city. And yet, in the search for light and breeze, for sunlight and fresh air, the South was discovered. And in the 20s, people started coming to Florida massively, for example. Now, I think a lot of people think that people started coming to Florida when air conditioning was invented. That's not the case. Air conditioning was invented in the post-war period, and yet Florida took off in the 20s, well before air conditioning. And we can see it, for example, in Coral Gables. You know, Palm Beach, the architecture's from the 20s. People were looking for light and air. If you look at the authors of Europe, you know, Robert Graves, all these post-World War II guys, Hemingway, they went to Spain, you know, where it was warm and breezy. And then in California, LA very, very quickly became the coolest place on earth, you know, with Hollywood, just to begin. That's where it had the great artistic flowering, was in the 20s, before air conditioning. And that's when the people started moving into the desert as well. So the first thing that happened that was permanent is people moved to what came to be called the Sun Belt. They moved south. I believe that there's a lot more of that going on. Like, for example, in Florida, people are leaving New York and coming here. And they say, well, it's because the taxes are too high in New York. You know, they just raised the taxes tremendously. They say, well, New York has the most COVID. Or they say, we want single-family houses, we don't want apartments. Well, guess what? They can go to other places to find that. They can go to Long Island. But they're coming to Florida. Right now, the explosion that is in which people purchasing single-family houses is in Florida. And the same thing happened in Los Angeles, you know, with those Mediterranean villas. And the same thing happened in Ibiza in Spain and the Costa del Sol, and in Italy as well. It was all discovered. That is going to continue to happening. And by the way, is that bad? Not necessarily. It's awfully nice. Most of you who are listening to me are actually living in the South, and you know the sheer pleasure of being able to be outdoors. Now, the funny thing is, the extent to which this now is being rediscovered right now. People are, for example, my own house. I have a nice courtyard house from the 20s. Did I have breakfast outdoors? Did I have guests outdoors? Did I really open my French doors? No, I forgot. I forgot to do that. And now, everything's open in the house, and I am using the courtyard fully. And all my guests are outdoors. People are now, the cafe tables are on the street. We had actually forgotten to be outdoors in Florida. If you look at the hotels, they all have internal corridors. You know, the old motels were individual units. The corridors were outside. Now that's all healthy. I mean, I'm an architect, and I thought I was doing a good job, and I thought I was being environmental, and I thought that I was a tropical architect that understood Florida. I wasn't. I'd forgotten. For me, Florida was a lot of glass. You know what I mean? You can see the houses full of glass. Where's the outside space? Oh, it's what's left over. Right now, the way we should design houses is starting with the courtyard. You start with the outdoor space. That's your living room outdoors. And then what's left over, you make your house. Just reverse it, like they did in the 20s. So anyway, that's one thing. The other thing that happened is that modern architecture, the clean white architecture, which is called modern architecture, came in with the pandemic. Before that time, decoration was very heavy, furniture was heavy. And then suddenly we had white walls, vinyl floors, we had furniture that was made of tubular material with just leather straps. Why? Because the germs, the pandemic, could live in stuffed furniture. We didn't want stuffed furniture, we wanted stuff we could wipe down. You know, the white walls, the counters that weren't sort of stone and tile, stuff we could clean, the big walls, the big openings to let the sunlight in. And then guess what? We discovered the roof terrace, the roof garden. Roof gardens didn't exist. Roofs were always pitched, right? And then suddenly the roofs were flat. And you could live on top. And then the porches, remember all those houses in the teens had porches, and then the porches disappeared, and they became terraces with pools. A terrace is not a porch. A porch cuts the sun. The terrace opens it up. So what we remember as modern architecture actually came then. And look, it's permeated. It's what we have now. In fact, what alerted me to this is that when I look at the really famous houses in LA in the 20s, they were called health houses. That's how they presented them. Come to the Lowell Health House. So they were thinking, all that glass and white was about health and all the gardens. Let's remember that. Okay? One last thing about this pandemic is we have to learn how to design public spaces in such a way that the spacing is natural. You know, I don't want to be seeing little places with 6 feet and so forth. And one of the things that I had the chance to be designing a town center for Vero Beach, and I had finished it before the pandemic, then I redesigned it after the pandemic, because what I wanted before that was crowding. You know, I wanted the intimate streets. I wanted the streets to be like a festival. I wanted face-to-face interaction. And suddenly, when I was presenting this to the people of Vero Beach, I sounded like a murderer. Oh yeah, you want us to, you know, breathe on each other? Well, really, isn't that what you hired me for? I said, no, that's not going to work anymore. And so how do we get spacing? And what we discovered is that they're very normative spacings. Like, for example, if you have a spacing of 10 feet, the tables are automatically spaced. If you have a spacing of 20 feet, like square of 20 feet, you can gather 6 people, which everybody says that's okay, right? How do you do that without painting on the floor? Landscape. Instead of just planting the trees willy-nilly, or the palm trees, we redesigned the whole thing so that all the parks were actually spaced at 10 or 20 feet. And so people come in, and without being told, they naturally socialize on the grid of the landscape. And that was like a real aha moment. Wow, so that's really what happens. Now, the other thing people are telling us, well, you know, you can't make pools. No pools anymore. People will gather, and I said, well, you can't make pools for old people, but you can make pools for young people. The kids still want pools. Like all the urban kids, their parents don't belong to clubs. Their parents can't drive them to the beach. They need pools nearby. I remember as a child that actually there were pools that were very shallow, just a couple of feet. So even the tiniest kids, they were almost like beaches. They came in, and so the tiniest kids could walk in and just splash around everything. The kids don't get sick. The little kids don't get sick. It's the adults that get sick. So let's continue to make pools, and let's continue to make all sorts of places that are only for children. And not just by saying only for kids. No, the adults are not going to use it because it doesn't serve them. You know, why do you want water up to your ankles? And so we began doing things like that. And we began doing shops that were all open, you know, like the old sheds, so that you could come in. And that's what we discovered. You know, those sheds that are used for shopping, they're also great classrooms. You know how people now are doing almost one-room schoolhouses, where the kids can actually gather, you know, 6 parents get together, they get 10 kids, and they hire, you know, a teacher, and they're having like a one-room schoolhouse. That doesn't work if it's indoors, but it works perfectly outdoors. So we created a whole bunch of market sheds, you know, for shopping after hours, which is where the shopping happens, perfectly after 5, after 6, you come in, pick up your groceries, the adults gather there to have coffee and drinks outdoor, you know, under a shed. And then during the day, they're classrooms for kids. And you see, I mean, this sounds like so normal. It's actually amazingly forgotten that this is the way we used to live. And we even designed a convention center that instead of being this big fat thing full of air conditioning, because convention centers are dead, who's going to go to that, you know? Well, why not make a thin convention center the way it used to be with cross ventilation? And then the hotel that is normally associated was actually separate cottages. So you didn't have to share a hallway, you know, and you could open the windows. You didn't have to share an air conditioning. None of this is torture. All of this is reminding people that life can be much more pleasant and that we have actually forgotten how to do it. So there is a blessing to the pandemic, and I do think this is going to hold. This is going to take hold because people are going to say, how pleasant it is to have dinner outside. You know, how pleasant it is to have windows that open. And so I was very pleased. After I got through the tragic part, I think it's a great thing that will happen.